Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Golding again, and we are going to continue and finish our discussion of Aristotle today. And we're going to get heavily, I hope, into the theory of St. Thomas Aquinas on virtue or ethics. That's what's on tap for today. And I have sent you some notes for this class, and this is the first topic we're going to talk a little bit about is, according to Aristotle, what is the motivation for behaving virtuously? That's what we've been calling the motivational question. What is the motivation? Why should people behave virtuously according to Aristotle? So it's pretty clear from everything we've said that according to Aristotle, we have a reason to be virtuous because if we are virtuous, we are going to be more likely to succeed in reaching our telos, in fulfilling our nature, in reaching the ultimate good for the human being, which is happiness. So, the main reason, and it seems like the only reason, according to Aristotle, for behaving virtuously is that it is going to promote your own happiness. By nature, we are happiness seekers, and therefore we ought to cultivate the virtues because the virtues will allow us to live a rational life. And if we live a rational life, we are more likely to reach happiness. Now, remember again, like we spoke about last time, according to Aristotle, happiness requires not just virtue, but also certain external goods that have to fall into place. Friends, family, and fortune, the three F's. Without those things, a person is not going to be happy, even if they are virtuous. Now, remember again that for Aristotle, happiness doesn't mean an emotion. Although that's often how we use the word today. You know, are you happy? Are you sad? What's your mood? How are you feeling today? Are you in a happy mood? Okay, well, Aristotle does not use the word happiness in that way. Or when we're thinking of the ultimate goal of human life, it's not to achieve certain happy emotions. The ultimate goal of the human being is to be the fully flourishing human, reaching your telos, actualizing your potential, and that means living a rational life. Also, we talked about the social nature of the human being, that we are by nature social creatures, and to live a fully humanly happy life, we need to be in some kind of a community or society with family and with friends, and that is what human happiness is about. But we need virtue in order to gain human happiness because we need to be guiding our actions and emotions with reason, and we need to be engaging in rational thought in the pure sense, pursuing knowledge. If we're doing all those things, then we are most likely to be happy. Okay, that is Aristotle's answer to the motivational question. And let's talk about some objections to that view. I think on the notes I put down two objections. They're somewhat related. But one objection would be that, at least according to some philosophers and some ordinary people as well, human beings are not only capable of acting out of a desire for their own happiness, but they're actually capable of acting for the sake of some other goal or end, or out of what Kant, the German philosopher Kant, so I put down the name Kant, K-A-N-T, famous German philosopher. We hope to study some of his works toward the latter part of the semester, but I just put down his name because Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher who lived in the 1800s, he very much was of the opinion that human beings are capable of acting out of a sense of duty. Okay, D-U-T-Y, duty. We are capable of doing things just because it is our duty to do so, without any thought necessarily of our own happiness or even our own well-being. Kant argued, he claimed, and we're not going to get into his argument too deeply today, but there are many thinkers, Kant being one of the most famous, who think that human beings are capable of acting just purely out of duty. And that means that our happiness, our own happiness, is not the main motivation or even the correct, true motivation for why we should be acting morally or justly or virtuously. So, for example, according to Kant, and you can see whether you agree with this or not, but Kant would claim that if you, let's suppose you do a good deed, you give charity or you're kind, you're generous. Remember, we talked about how Aristotle thinks that generosity is a virtue, that one should give, of course, with reason, but that one should give away one's possessions or, let's say, help other people out when they are in need. Aristotle would say that that's a good thing. But according to Aristotle, it seems that the reason, the motivation for doing that is because it's going to make you happier. It's because it's going to lead to a happier life for you. Kant would say that if you're giving charity or helping someone else out of your own self-interest, then that is not genuinely a moral action. So that would seem to be at least a disagreement, if not an objection, against Aristotle's theory. Of course, if you believe that human beings by nature are self-interested and we can't really act any other way than in a self-interested way, if by nature we are egoists, then you're not going to think too much of this objection. Okay? But for those of us who think that humans are capable of acting out of genuine altruistic motives or out of some kind of a sense of duty, then Aristotle's theory is not successful. Aristotle's theory is mistaken. Okay, so you can think about whether you like that objection or not, or agree with it. Let's move on to a second objection. Another objection against Aristotle's theory is that it seems the way Aristotle describes the relationship between virtue and happiness, that there can be situations, circumstances in which it's going to turn out that it makes more sense to do a bad action than a virtuous action, or to use the correct terminology, a vicious action rather than a virtuous action. And remember that virtue is good character, vice is bad character, right? So Aristotle has this whole list of virtues that he believes we ought to cultivate. And they all have to do with using reason to guide your actions and emotions. Okay, well, I'm going to paint a picture. I'm going to describe a set of circumstances in which it's going to turn out that, according to Aristotle's theory, he might want to somehow squeeze out of this. He's not going to like this. He's not going to want to endorse this. But it looks like, given his theory, that there's going to be an absurd result. The absurd result is going to be that in a certain situation, his theory would yield the result that one ought to do the vicious action rather than the virtuous action. Okay, so bear with me here. I'm going to describe a little bit of a scenario. We're going to call this, just for lack of a better name, this is the scenario that involves the successful businessman with a dark past. Okay, the successful businessman with a dark past. So imagine you have a guy who, when he was, let's say, in his 20s, relatively young man, he got involved in the business world, and he was not such a great guy back then, and he was involved in some swindling, cheating, and he managed to somehow cheat someone or some group of people, and he amassed a little bit of a fortune, like several $1 million by swindle, some business deal that he cheated somebody on and swindled, and he got away with it. No one caught him, no one realized it, and he made several $1 million in through a dishonest and cheating fashion. Okay, now let's suppose this fellow, as he got older, he's sort of, he got a little bit better as time went on, better and better. He finally became an honest businessman. Let's suppose he marries and he has children, and he is a very well established businessman. He's not just a businessman, he's also a well established member of the community. He engages in, let's say, rational thought to a large degree. He studies, he learns. He sort of, let's imagine that he studies Aristotle and he finds Aristotle's theory to be very, compelling and attractive. He says, yes, it's important to live a rational life. Yes, it's important to pursue human flourishing. And he thinks he's kind of done that in a way by engaging in rational thought, and he doesn't cheat anybody anymore. He doesn't do any bad stuff. He's very much into this Aristotelian goal of self-actualization. Okay, now let's say he's in his 40s now, and he has a family, he has a wife, he has a beautiful house. He's known as a donor to all sorts of charitable causes, and so on and so forth. Okay, now let's suppose that one day he gets a phone call from someone who knew him when he was in his 20s and actually has evidence that he was a swindler back then, and this person threatens to expose him, and he now, this businessman, this successful man, is, oh no, he's like really scared by this, because his whole life now is going to be thrown into turmoil. If this comes out that, yeah, he swindled when he was in his 20s, he was a swindler and he made millions of dollars, and people are going to say, oh, so that's how he made his fortune. And let's suppose, I know this may sound a little bit hokey, but imagine, this businessman figures out that if this comes to the surface, his life is going to basically be ruined. He's going to have to go to prison. He's going to have to pay back millions of dollars. He's going to be embarrassed. His wife is going to maybe even dump him. His children are going to say, Dad, I can't believe you were this rotten person. Okay, so I know this may sound a little bit like of an exaggeration, but let's suppose circumstances are such that this guy figures out that if this bad, dark past comes to the surface, he's essentially going to be ruined. He's going to have to go to prison. He's going to lose his family, his friends, and his fortune. Okay, suppose he knows that if this comes to light, he's going to lose his family, friends, and fortune. That means that according to Aristotle, he is going to lose his happiness. Okay, so according to, now if he's thinking about this in the way that Aristotle would presumably have us think about this situation, let's now suppose that he comes up with a plan. The plan is essentially to murder the person who wants to expose him. Okay, suppose he somehow, he knows some people who are in the mafia. He knows some people who are from his past when he was not such a great guy. Maybe some people who are associated with the swindle. He knows some people who are pretty rough characters, although he's kind of been out of touch with them for a long time because he's gone down a very, virtuous path since then. So, but he knows some people who he could hire. He's going to make a phone call. Hey, I need you to knock this guy off. He's going to expose me, and we're all going to be in trouble, and my happiness is going to go down the drain. So let's suppose he now has the option of choosing to have this guy murdered. And he's pretty certain that this can be done without being found out. Of course, there's some risk involved in that. Maybe he will be found out, but these people are professional killers. They know what they're doing. And he figures out that he can have this guy bumped off, sorry to use that term, and that way no one will ever know that he swindled, and everything will just sort of continue on, and he will just sort of continue living happily ever after, at least the way Aristotle thinks that happiness works. Family, friends, and fortune are necessary for happiness. And here, if he does the virtuous thing, now presumably the virtuous thing to do would be to, admit it, say, yeah, I did something wrong. Certainly it is not virtuous to go murder someone, even if they are threatening to expose you for something you did a long time ago. I mean, that's not a very nice thing to do, but that would be a case of murder, right? So it looks like in this situation, this scenario that I have described is not very, it's not likely to happen to everybody, but it could happen to people, and it does happen to people. In fact, people sometimes do find themselves in a situation where they're essentially in a pickle. What I mean by that is that they are in a situation where if they don't do the vicious thing, their happiness, at least the way Aristotle seems to understand happiness, is going to be exploded. And so therefore, it looks like that in this situation, Aristotle's theory leads to the result that this person should be motivated to do this vicious thing, and there's no reason why he shouldn't do the vicious thing. The only reason for being virtuous in the first place is because it promotes happiness. Well, in this particular instance, doing the vicious thing is going to promote happiness, right? That's the way it seems. So therefore, according to Aristotle's theory, in this situation, the absurd result would be that this person ought to do the vicious thing. And I think that for many of us, that would be a refutation. That would show that there's something wrong with Aristotle's theory if it leads to the result that one ought to do a vicious thing. This sounds like Thrasymachus, right? Remember Thrasymachus, the character who we studied a little bit earlier when we were doing Plato? He says that, sometimes it's good to be bad, right? That injustice is a virtue. Well, Aristotle doesn't want to say that injustice is a virtue. He wants to say that one should always be just. Yet it seems, according to his theory, that in certain situations, one should be unjust. Of course, now this is not a problem for Plato. At least, there may be other problems with Plato's theory, but just to contrast here, that Plato's theory would be, or according to Plato, in such a situation, the right thing to do would be to do the just thing. Because remember, according to Plato, his conception of true human happiness is all about the internal balance and harmony of the soul and the relationship with the good, right? So according to Plato, even if what you're going to do is going to cause you to suffer some loss of money, fortune, family, friends, as long as you're doing what's better for your soul, you're doing what is in your own interest to do, right? And of course, with Plato, we talked about, so anyway, let me just nail down that point before I go on to anything else, that according to Plato, this specific objection would not work. He would say, no, my theory indicates that you should always seek a harmony of the soul, do the right thing, do the just thing, and one should never do a vicious thing because that damages the soul, right? Whereas according to Aristotle, it seems like because he places emphasis on the necessity for family, friends, and fortune, that sometimes doing the wrong thing is going to save your family, friends, and fortune. Okay, now another difference between Plato and Aristotle is that according to Plato, remember we talked about the double motivation theory. According to Plato, we have the idea that not only is it about pursuing your own happiness, internal psychic happiness, but also according to Plato, one should act out of a recognition of the good, that the recognition of the good is going to somehow inspire the human being to act in a good, little g, good way, right? Now, for Aristotle, there is no such thing as the good other than happiness. That is the good. So just to nail that down, there's an important difference between Plato and Aristotle, right? With regard to the good. Plato thinks that the good is this eternal, everlasting source of all being, this kind of godlike entity that is the source, the ultimate truth. It's the thing that makes everything be what it is, the form of all forms, the mother of all forms, like the sun. Okay, so that is the good according to Plato. It's an external thing that we can sort of relate to or not relate to well, right? Whereas according to Aristotle, there's no such thing as the good. The good does not exist outside of ourselves. Rather, the good is that end that we are pursuing, the ultimate goal, which is happiness. Okay, so that's a very important difference between Plato and Aristotle. Anyway, I did digress a little bit. Topic number one, again, to tie that down, was that according to Aristotle, the motivation for behaving virtuously is the pursuit of one's own happiness. That in order to be happy, we need to have virtue. What we've now gone through is that there's a couple of objections to that. One is that, according to someone like Kant or anyone who agrees with him, that's not the motivation, or that certainly shouldn't be the only motivation for behaving virtuously, and therefore his theory of human motivation or his theory of moral motivation is wrong, or in need we have to figure out, well, then what is, what would drive someone to keep their duty if it's not self-interest? And that's not such a simple question. But that was objection number one. And objection number two was that it seems like according to Aristotle's theory, there will be cases where doing the wrong thing is actually going to help your happiness more, and therefore, why wouldn't you want to do it according to Aristotle's theory? Okay, so that is what we have to say about topic number one and the objections. Topic two, I may have said this already. I think I did talk about this a little last time. Don't have to spend too much time on it right now, but it is definitely the case that Aristotle believes in moral universalism. In this way, he agrees with Plato. Moral universalism, again, is the view that whatever's morally right is morally right for everybody, that morality doesn't change from time to time or place to place or from person to person. Morality doesn't change, right? According to Aristotle, human beings have a telos, we have a nature. The essence of the human being is basically the same. Yes, there are differences between people, but ultimately human flourishing is the same for all humans, and therefore the virtues are the same for all humans. Theoretical virtue, practical virtue, following the doctrine of the mean between extremes, it is the same. All human beings ought to follow the doctrine of the mean between extremes with regard to their emotions and actions. So, and there's an objective fact. There is an objective fact about virtue. So, for example, it is objectively true, according to Aristotle, that that hedonism is wrong. That's just a fact. It is not a matter of opinion or taste. Some people like pleasure, some people don't like pleasure. No, Aristotle would say that the pursuit of pleasure as a goal in life is just wrong. It's objectively not what humans ought to do. Now, we did say that because when you apply the doctrine of the mean, you have to take into account your circumstances, your situation, your capacities, your abilities. What counts as too much alcohol for me is a lot different than what counts as too much alcohol for my wife. My wife has a few drinks and she's, quite lit already. I have a few drinks and I'm barely getting started. Okay, maybe it's not such a great example, but it's true. Okay, so what counts as too much? Either way, drunkenness is wrong for both of us, okay? Drinking too much would be an excess of the pursuit of pleasure, let's suppose. Okay, so despite the fact that Aristotle introduces a little bit of relativity into the application of the doctrine of the mean, drunkenness is still basically a vice, whether it's for me or my wife or any human being. Drinking too much is not good. What counts as drinking too much, that's what depends on the person, the place, and the time, right? Maybe if you're at a very, very fancy dinner, having one cocktail is appropriate. Maybe when it's Saturday night and you're just watching a ball game, having a few beers and a cocktail is really okay. Depends on the time, depends on the place, depends on the situation, depends on the context. What determines what is drinking too much? But that doesn't mean that you are a relativist about morality if you think that you need to take those circumstantial things into account. Okay, so again, we're saying that Aristotle counts as a moral universalist and an objectivist, even though he does agree that to apply the doctrine of the mean, you need to take into account specific individual circumstances. All right, moving on right along to topic number 3, our last topic for today and for our discussion of Aristotle, at least today. We haven't really talked about this much. We talked about teleology quite a lot, the teleological doctrine, that every natural creature, including the human being, has a goal or an end that is suited to the purpose or suited to the nature of that being. And by nature, we are striving toward that goal. Okay, many people, we're going to see that Thomas Hobbes, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher we're going to study after Aquinas, Thomas Hobbes does not agree with the teleological doctrine, and many contemporary philosophers disagree with or are skeptical about teleology, okay? So when we get into Hobbes, we'll do a little more about why Hobbes does not agree with teleology, but basically, well, just maybe a little bit would be helpful at this point, that some people say, look, what we have in our world is causation, okay? Cause and effect, right? In other words, if you, if you put water in a pot on the stove and you turn the gas on, the flame on, the heat will cause the water to boil, right? If you take the water and you put it into the ice box, it will freeze, okay? Heating the temperature of the water up makes it boil. Lowering the temperature of the water makes it freeze. Now, that's cause and effect, and luckily we live in a world where cause and effect is very predictable, right? In other words, we're able to make coffee in the morning or make iced tea in a regular way because we know that, hey, if I put it on the stove, it's going to boil. If I put it in the freezer, it's going to become ice. So it's a very convenient, helpful thing for us that the world works in this way. There's a lot of regularity in nature, right? If you take an apple seed and you put it in the ground and you water it and you give it enough sunshine and no rabbits come along and eat it up while it's beginning to grow, well then, yeah, it's going to become an apple tree. But if you take that apple seed and flush it down the toilets, it doesn't become an apple tree, okay? If you eat an apple and you swallow the seeds, luckily you don't get an apple tree growing in your stomach, right? So what we see here in the world is that there is cause and effect, that there are certain events that cause other things to happen. Okay, now wouldn't it be kind of crazy to say that the proper telos of water is to become hot coffee? It would be just as silly as saying that the proper end goal of water is to become ice. Okay, so I'm just sort of articulating for your benefit this view against teleology, that yes, there are certain things that will happen to an apple seed if it's planted and if it's watered and if it gets sunshine, it becomes an apple tree. But it could easily become like you can take apple seeds and use them to, decorate the back of your notebook. You could take apple seeds and make them into a little pattern, a little design that spells out your name. So what is the true telos of the apple seed? This theory, or those who disagree with teleology, say that it just depends on what happens to the thing. If certain things happen to it, it's going to become an apple tree. If other things happen to it, it's not going to become an apple tree. But there is no teleology. There's no ultimate goal or telos that is suited to the nature of somehow that's what it's supposed to do. That's what it's shooting for. Okay, so that's one kind of objection to teleology. We have cause and effect, but we don't have a telos. Another way of objecting to teleology is, in the case of the human being, Aristotle wants to say that the telos of the human is to live is to fulfill his or her potential, right? Okay, but anything you could argue, this, I'm not sure I agree with this, but I'm articulating an anti-teleology view here. Okay, anything that I do would be a fulfillment, or would be an actualization of some potential that I have, right? I mean, I have the potential to start jumping up and down, screaming obscenities at the top of my lungs. I have the potential right now to take an axe and just smash this computer into bits. I'm not going to do that because I don't want to do that. But I have the potential to engage in all sorts of bizarre behaviors, or what someone might call bizarre, right? I have the potential to sit in front of the TV all day and just veg out watching reruns of Gilligan's Island, or watching, shows from, the 1950s. I have the potential to do that, at least with a lot of my time, let's suppose, okay? So that's a potential that I have. So I'm actualizing my potential no matter what I do. If I run around being a murderer or a thief or a robber, I am somehow actualizing my potential. Now, if Aristotle is going to say, wait a second, but that's not rational. That's not rational to engage in. And so here we come back perhaps to that objection, where we said, this is when we were doing that so-called function argument, that Aristotle said that the human being is a rational animal. Okay, well, let's suppose I agree that, I have rationality. That is one of my capacities. But I also have the ability to behave irrationally. And why are we picking on rationality as somehow the gold standard for how I ought to behave? I can behave irrationally if I want to. Now, it's true that if I behave irrationally a lot of the time, all the time, most of the time, I'm probably going to get myself killed pretty quickly, right? If I behave irrationally by running out into the street in the middle of a busy, busy street, well, then I'm going to get myself killed. So that'd be kind of stupid if I'm interested in my own happiness and well-being. But there are a lot of things that I could do that are not going to get myself killed, and still sort of live a life that's what I feel like living, right? So this goes a little bit to the issue of, Aristotle's trying to say, no, there is an objective fact as to what the telos of the human being is. And many people might say, we don't have a telos. We find ourselves here in nature. How we got here, I don't know. Let's suppose somebody says that. Let's suppose maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. Where for Aristotle, we're here, we are natural creatures. Okay, we have certain impulses, we have certain inclinations and drives and needs and wants and desires. We also have reason, that's true. We can use reason to try to figure out how to get what we want in the world. But what is the telos of the human? Some philosophers would say we don't have a telos. We just simply have desires, and we make choices about which desires we're going to fulfill. And so if the teleological doctrine is false, then Aristotle's theory basically falls apart because it's based upon the teleological doctrine. Okay, Now, just a third reason for thinking that teleology might be wrong, and this is a debate that is going on in biology and science. Some people would say that given the modern theory of evolution, that the world somehow evolved or evolves naturally, and we have, human beings evolve somehow from primitive species, sort of by luck, by chance. I'm sure you've heard about the notion of the doctrine of natural selection, and the idea that those species that manage to adapt and reproduce are the species that manage to remain in existence, right? And there are many, 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 countless billions of species apparently that scientists say are extinct because those species could not adapt to their circumstances, or for whatever reason they don't exist any longer. So if and some biologists believe in what's called blind evolution, that there's no telos, there's no goal or end for the sake of which humans exist. We just somehow, by hook or by crook, through some kind of process of natural selection, human beings evolved and we're here. But there's no why we're here. There's no ultimate goal or purpose for why we are here. We just happen to get here. And if you believe that, it seems like, okay, then teleology is false, and that means that Aristotle's theory of ethics is wrong. So, not telling you whether or not to believe in teleology, I think as a segue into Aquinas, okay, we're gonna be shifting into studying Thomas Aquinas, the great Christian philosopher, probably, if not the most famous, one of the most famous Christian philosophers ever to have lived in the medieval times. I just want to say a little bit about Aquinas. Is going to have a lot of criticisms of Aristotle for various reasons, and we're going to get into that. But Aquinas would say, you know what? Teleology is true. There is such a thing as the teleological doctrine. All right? Creatures do have a telos that is part of their designated nature. But according to Aquinas, that is only so because of God, right? Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, Christian philosopher, Christian thinker, very much influenced by Christianity, but also his own thinking, and we'll get into that. Aquinas thought that you cannot have teleology without God. God is the designer of nature. God is the intelligent, supreme, perfect being who designed the universe, created the universe, designed the universe to be what it is. And God created the human being with a certain goal or end in mind. So according to Aquinas, yes, we do have teleology, but it's not just sort of a natural thing. It really comes from a supernatural source, namely God. So I guess you could say that's a third way of criticizing Aristotle, is saying, yes, teleology is true, but it's only true because of God. And if you don't believe in God, or if you don't have God in your picture, the intelligent, supreme, designing being, then you wouldn't have teleology, and that would mean that any theory based on teleology wouldn't work. So, okay, we're gonna see that again. Aquinas does believe in God, and he does believe in teleology. The point here I'm making is that according to Aquinas, Aristotle's theory is missing something. He's right about teleology, but teleology can only be true if there is a designer of nature, and that would be God. And Aristotle did not believe in that kind of God for sure. Okay, I have basically concluded lecturing about Aristotle's theory of ethics. I'm sure there's more to talk about. Maybe you have questions, comments, thoughts, but we're going to move on and get now into Thomas Aquinas for the remainder of this lecture. And then next lecture also we'll be talking about some other aspects of Aquinas. So we'll see how much we can do in the remaining time. Um, again, Aquinas was a medieval philosopher, a Christian. Some of you may or may not know this, but during the medieval period in Europe and also in certain parts of the Middle East, many Christians and Jewish and Islamic thinkers were very highly impressed. Not all of them, but many of the medieval Christian, Jewish, and Islamic thinkers were very impressed with or by Aristotle's works. Aristotle was considered for many years, long into the Middle Ages, until we get to something called modern philosophy, which maybe begins in 1400s or 1500s. Until that time, Aristotle was kind of the dominant figure for many of these thinkers. Okay, now, of course, Aristotle was not a Christian. Aquinas would refer to Aristotle as a pagan philosopher, okay, because Aristotle was neither a Christian nor a Jew nor a Muslim, so he was a pagan. But basically, Aquinas thought that Aristotle was a very smart man, very wise individual. And he was able to use reason, the human natural power of reason. How we got it doesn't matter. We have rationality. And so according to Aquinas, Aristotle was an amazingly brilliant thinker. And so basically, I put down on your notes a little slogan, and the slogan is an oversimplification. I will try to clarify why. But the slogan is, if you take Aristotle and you combine it with Christianity, you get Aquinas' view, at least about ethics, okay? What is Aquinas' view about ethics? It's basically Aristotle plus Christianity equals Aquinas' ethics. Now, in other words, combine, harmonize. That's what a lot of people think Aquinas was basically doing, was he was a Christian. And you, of course, know that Aristotle lived before the time of Christ. So Aristotle had no knowledge of Christianity. All right, Aristotle was in the 200s, 300s BC or BCE, before the Common Era. Okay, well then Aristotle could not have known about Christianity because he was born and died before Jesus ever came along. Now, it's possible that Aristotle maybe knew a little bit about Judaism. There's some discussion about that, but we won't worry about that. Aristotle did not know anything of Christianity. Okay, Aquinas is writing in the 1200s, and so he's a Christian, but he is familiar with Aristotle. So he takes Aristotle's ethics, tries to harmonize or combine it with Christianity, and come up with what we call Aquinas' view of virtue. So now I say it's an oversimplification because there are certain things in Aristotle that Aquinas thought he got wrong. So you can't just take everything Aristotle said, combine it with Christianity. There are certain things that Aristotle got wrong, certain things that are not consistent with Christianity, certain things even that Aristotle may have gotten wrong, even on the basis of his own reason that he should have realized were mistaken. So there are certain things that Aristotle got wrong. You have to take those things out. So if you want to fix up the slogan, you could say Christianity plus Aristotle minus certain things in Aristotle equals Aquinas. Okay, that would be less of an oversimplification. All right, so our job here is going to be very straightforward because we just studied Aristotle. Isn't that amazing? We just got through studying Aristotle, and so we're going to talk about a list of things, and we won't have to spend too much time on it because we already spent time on this. A list of things that, according to Aquinas, Aristotle got right. Okay, and I put some of these things down on your sheet there that I sent you. For example, let's see, Aquinas believes in teleology. Yes, there are natural goals embedded in nature. Everything has, every kind of thing, including the human being, has a telos or an end or a goal that is suited to the nature of that thing. So yes, that's true. Of course, for Aquinas, as I already mentioned, teleology comes from God. It's God who designed us, designed the world with the nature and the teloi, plural for telos, that all things have. But teleology is true, so Aristotle was right about that. Another important thing Aristotle was right about that is that basically the human being is a rational animal. Okay, we're not perfectly rational. We have some other interesting dimensions to our being that maybe Aristotle was not aware of. But according to Aquinas, it's basically true that we are rational creatures. Okay, and in fact, that's not only for Aquinas, it's not only what makes us different from animals, but to some degree, that is what makes us like God, because God, according to Aquinas, okay, is supremely rational. God is supremely wise and intelligent. Indeed, that's one of God's perfections. His knowledge, his understanding, his ability to know. God's intellect is infinite. It's perfect. Okay, if you can imagine such a thing. God's intellect, God's ability to understand and to know is infinite and perfect. Okay, now we humans, we have an intellect that's finite. Okay, so our intellect is not as good as God's intellect, but it's one of the ways in which we are most like God, that we have rational capacity. We have the ability to deliberate, to make choices in a way that animals really do not, because animals operate for the most part by, habit, instinct, and by sort of by rote. Okay, so the point here I'm making is that for Aquinas, we are rational creatures. That's very much an important part of our essence. All right. Virtue to some extent is going to involve living a rational life. That's true. And I say to some extent because there's some portions of virtue that go beyond living a rational life, and we'll get to that. But to a large degree, Aristotle was correct when he said that virtue involves cultivating those character traits that allow us or cause us to live a rational life, using reason to pursue knowledge, to gain knowledge, theoretical virtue, the two uses of reason. He was right about that. Therefore, it follows that there's two branches of virtue, at least, okay? So far, for now, we're saying these are things that Aquinas agrees with Aristotle about, that there are two main branches of virtue. And furthermore, that virtue is necessary for living a happy life. All right, we have a telos, yes, that's true. And it's going to be the case that we need to develop virtue in order to reach happiness. That's also correct. We're going to see that there's another dimension to happiness. Happiness is our ultimate end. The highest good is happiness. That is true. Okay, now, and virtue is necessary for reaching happiness. So, all of these things are things that Aristotle got right according to Aquinas. Now, what we need to go into now here is those things that Aristotle got wrong or that he missed. Now, some of these things come from Christianity. Some of these things Aristotle, according to Aquinas, Aristotle should have known better, should have gotten right. But I'm going to go through, I have on the sheet, there's like a list here of things that Aristotle missed or did not get right. Okay, so, and these are not necessarily in order of importance, but so let's just talk about some of them. Maybe some are more important than others, or some are more foundational. One thing that Aristotle did not know of, and this was not his fault, Aquinas believes that there are two main sources of knowledge: reason and revelation. Okay, we're introducing the term revelation here. I don't think we've used that term. Maybe we did a little bit when contrasting Plato's conception of the good with the Judeo-Christian conception of God. Okay, but Plato and Aristotle didn't really believe in revelation. They didn't have a notion of revelation. Or at least if they did, it was not important to their ethical theory. Okay, well, according to Christianity, in addition to the fact that we have reason, now we also have the senses, right? Aquinas, it's not just reason. You have to really say reason and sense experience. Lump that together into one source of knowledge. Our rational capacities and also our sensory capacities. That's all one. The natural way in which we know about the world, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, plus thinking and reasoning, applying our thought processes to what we experience through the senses. All of that is one source of information. But there is another source of information which we are calling revelation. Now, what exactly is revelation? This is a theological notion. It's a notion, it's an idea that is found in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and other religions as well, but we're focusing on the Christian version of this, which to some degree overlaps with the Jewish and Islamic version. Okay, revelation. What is revelation? Well, revelation is basically, it presupposes that there is a God, okay? And that God is in some sense the supreme being. We'll get to that in a little while. But this God, who is the supreme being, sometimes, on occasion, decides to communicate certain information to, let's say, a prophet or a group of prophets, or it could be to a group of people. Okay, so for example, in Judaism, there's the notion taught, there's a doctrine of the revelation at Sinai to the people of Israel. All right, it's in the scriptures, it's in the book of Exodus, described. Whether this is true or not doesn't really matter right now, but this is the view. This is the view that comes out of Judaism, is that there is such a thing as revelation. That on occasion, God decides to reveal certain truths or information to prophets or to people, and then once that revelation happens, that can then be taught to children and children's children and children's children. So a revelation can be learned and taught and then given over or passed down by tradition to the next generation. Okay, so now for Christians, there's revelation. The prophets of old, Abraham was a prophet, Moses was a prophet, and according to Christianity, the most important revelation of all is really not a prophet, but it's Jesus, right? Jesus, according to Christianity, is the revelation of God walking on the earth, right? In some sense, Jesus is divine himself, at least according to traditional, hardcore Christianity. Jesus is not a prophet. Jesus is both man and divine. Jesus is a very unique individual, right? He's not just another prophet. But anyway, the point is that Christians, Aquinas, believe in revelation. There's a certain body of information that we can know about the world, about God, about what's going to happen to us when we die, and that's based on revelation. Now, Aristotle did not have revelation. He did not have a revelation himself. He did not claim to have revelation. He didn't know of such things. Maybe he would have been skeptical, and we can talk about that later on. But right now, the point is that according to Aquinas, here's something Aristotle missed. There are two sources of knowledge. It's not just what we can know on our own through rational thought, but we also have important knowledge about both God, the universe, the world, human affairs, human destiny, based on this source. You could say it's a miraculous thing. Prophecy is an unusual thing. It's not part of the ordinary experience of the way humans go about learning about the world. Okay, but according to Aquinas, we have not only reason, we also have revelation. Now, one of the things that we know, another thing that Aristotle missed is the existence of God. Now, Aristotle did believe in a certain concept of God. It's not that he was an atheist completely, but Aristotle was definitely what we might say more of a deist, okay? A deist, that's spelled D-E-I-S-T, deist. A deist is someone who believes in God. He might believe in more than one God or gods, but basically a deistic conception of God is that God is basically a impersonal, not interested particularly in the affairs of human beings, certainly not interested in the affairs of individual human beings, doesn't really pay attention to the lives or even care about the lives of individual human beings. Okay, so um, there may be other ways of defining deism, but basically the difference between deism and theism, okay, theism spelled with Theism, theism is the doctrine where you believe in a God who is capable or is interested in a personal relationship with either some human beings or all human beings. So monotheism, of course, is the belief in one God who is a being that is interested in the affairs of individual human beings. Okay, so Aristotle was not a theist. He was a deist, but not a theist. Okay, well, basically, Aquinas believes that the existence of a supreme perfect being is demonstrable, can be proven by looking around the world, by studying the world, by seeing that there's cause and effect in the world, by seeing that there is apparently design in nature. Okay, in fact, this is called the teleological argument for God's existence. Basically, Aquinas thought that when you see the design that is exhibited in nature, you come to the conclusion that there has to be a designer, and that would be God. So the belief in a supreme being is partly, according to Aquinas, the belief in a supreme being who is supremely good and supremely perfect is based on reason. Now, the belief that that being is interested in the affairs of the human being or cares about us, that is a little bit more difficult for me to say. According to Aquinas, a lot of that is really based on revelation. The belief that God has a plan, the belief that God communicates with human beings, the belief that God is engaged in prophetic communication with human beings, that's based upon the scriptures, that's based upon revelation. Okay? So the belief that there is a supreme being, a supreme perfect entity, Aquinas thought that that was a rational belief just looking around the world. The belief that God is engaged in our lives, that God cares about us, that we can have some kind of a personal relationship with God, that is based upon revelation. And that's certainly something that Aristotle did not have. So there is a supreme being, this being exists, and this being is available for a personal relationship with us. That is based on revelation. Now, another very important thing is that, and this is really getting now towards the differences between Aristotle's ethics and Aquinas' ethics, is that there are two kinds of happiness. Aristotle was only aware of one. Okay? The two kinds of happiness that are available to the human being are natural happiness and supernatural happiness. Okay? In other words, Aristotle was correct that happiness is the goal. Happiness is the telos. We are all striving, we are all shooting for happiness. But Aquinas comes along and says, based on revelation, we know that there's two kinds of happiness. There's a lower kind of happiness and a higher kind of happiness. The lower kind of happiness, that's what we're calling natural happiness. The higher kind of happiness is what is called supernatural happiness. Now, natural happiness is what Aristotle was aware of. Natural happiness is the kind of thing that we talked about before. Flourishing, realizing your potential as a human being, living a rational life. Oh, I forgot to mention that according to Aquinas, this is important, man is a social animal. That whole concept that the human being is not just rational but social in nature. that in general the human being is a social animal and seeks to fulfill his or her potential in the context of a society. Okay, Aquinas says that Aristotle was right about that. We are social animals. All right. So all of that, though, is part of the natural end of mankind. And that would take place, if it does take place, it takes place in this material world that we live in. Okay, some people make it, some people don't make it, not everybody reaches it. But the natural end of man, if it is reached at all, it's reached in this world. Now, what exactly is the supernatural happiness or the supernatural end of man? Okay, so the supernatural end of man, of the human being, is something that is only reached in the next world. When the soul dies, when the body dies and the soul departs from the body, I guess that is a kind of death for the soul. When you die, what happens is your soul, if you're lucky enough, if you've done the right things, you have a chance to go to heaven. Now, what exactly is heaven? Aquinas talks about the notion of the beatific vision. The beatific vision, that is the blessed vision of God in the next world. Okay, it's some kind of a relationship with God that only fully takes place in the next world, where you kind of lock on to your soul, locks on to the perfect being. And that event, that state is just the most amazing, blissful state that one can possibly ever even dream of or imagine. That is the ultimate end of man. So I say that there's two kinds of happiness. There's two aspects or two parts of our telos. The real telos is, of course, the final one. The ultimate reason, the ultimate goal for the sake of which God designed and created the human being, both collectively, socially, individually, is with that God had in mind the design of the creature in such a way that it would be destined to reach the ultimate goal of the beatific vision of God in the next world. That is the ultimate telos. That's the true telos. So it's not like Aristotle just missed something that if you add that, it helps. It's like he really, according to Aquinas, missed the most important part of what our ultimate telos is. It's something that takes place in the next world after the body dies. Now, should Aristotle be blamed for not knowing that this really is the telos of man? Aquinas would say no. That's not his fault. Aristotle had reason, he had his senses, he used reason and sense experience to learn about the world, the natural world, but he was kind of stuck in this world. He was not aware of this higher realm. He was not aware of God as a truly perfect being who cares about human beings and who has designed us with this ultimate, highest goal in mind. So the fact that Aristotle did not know about the beatific vision was not his fault. But the fact remains that he missed it, and without it, one's understanding of virtue is incomplete. So this is something that Aristotle missed. All right. Now, the next step here is also very important. Because there are two kinds of happiness, it turns out that there are two kinds of virtue. There are two radically different kinds. Well, they're somewhat related. Maybe I shouldn't say they're radically different. There are two kinds of virtue. There's natural virtue, and that's what Aristotle got right. Everything Aristotle said about natural virtue was correct. That it has to do with living a rational life, developing certain character traits that allow you to live a rational life. Theoretical virtue, practical virtue. Practical and theoretical virtue are two branches of natural virtue. On the other end, you have theological virtue. This is what Aristotle had no clue about, because what is theological virtue? Theological virtue consists in those character traits that are necessary in order to reach supernatural happiness. Okay, I hope you see the parallel here. Natural virtue, that's what you need in order to gain natural happiness. Aristotle got all of that pretty much correct. But when it comes to theological virtue, Aristotle didn't know about that. But it's a parallel definition. All of those character traits that we need in order to gain spiritual bliss in the next world, those are what we might call, if you want to call them, religious virtues, as opposed to natural virtues. The religious or theological, having to do with God, the theological virtues are known to us based on revelation. Okay, it's based on revelation that we know that there is a possibility of gaining a next world relationship with God, and it's based upon revelation that we know what the theological virtues are. And you need, according to Aquinas, a human being to live a fully virtuous life needs to be developing both the natural virtues and the theological virtues. But in some sense, the theological virtues are higher, they're more important, because they are really what we need to get to our true and ultimate goal. And just before we conclude, this reminds me of something I wanted to say, and I may have said this before, but I'm not sure, so I'm saying it again, that according to Aquinas, I know I said this in at least one or two of the sections, but maybe not all of them. According to Aquinas, remember when Aristotle's talking about what are the criteria for a highest good? And Aristotle says that a highest good is going to be something that you pursue for its own sake. It's going to be something that everything you do, you pursue for the sake of that goal. It's going to be something such that all by itself it makes life worth living and you wouldn't want anything else. You wouldn't be lacking in anything. Okay, well, Aquinas would say, you know what? Even without revelation, let's suppose we had never had any revelation whatsoever. Well, I can think about the idea of an infinite good, a good that lasts forever and is somehow infinite in its quality, not just its quantity. I mean, how that might work, I'm not so sure. But one way in which an infinite good can be infinite is that it is everlasting, right? And so if we're interested in seeking the highest good as the ultimate goal, then Aquinas would say we need to consider the possibility that maybe there's something we can do that might get us to that infinite good, that infinite status of happiness. Now, what could that possibly be? Well, along comes revelation, Christianity, and in different forms, Judaism and Islam, and they teach that, hey, you know what? It is possible to gain an infinite good. The only way to do it is to have some kind of relationship with the infinitely perfect being, namely God. And the only way for it to last forever is if it is something that takes place after you die, because we surely know that our bodies don't seem to live forever, although some people do believe in the notion of resurrection. But it seems like, for the most part, people die and that's it. So if there is an infinite good, it would have to be something that involves some kind of an afterlife or a resurrection or something that takes place in the realm of the souls. So Aquinas is saying, naturally we can come up with the idea of an infinite good. Aristotle might say, yeah, but there is no such thing. So Aquinas would say, wait a second, there is. And that's the good news. That is the gospel. The gospel is that, based on the Christian tradition, the good news is that there is a way to gain an infinitely blissful state. Maybe there's other aspects to the notion of gospel, but the good news is that that infinite good is accessible. You just have to play your cards right. What does that mean? For Aquinas, you have to develop theological virtue. So we're going to draw it to a close today. We did a lot getting into Aquinas. Next time we're going to talk about specifically what are the theological virtues and how they sort of resemble or parallel, but in a way go beyond the natural virtues. And we're also going to talk about some other aspects of Aquinas' theory. We can also talk about criticisms and so on and so forth. So look forward to another lecture on Aquinas next Tuesday. In the meantime, stay well, be well. Again, if you have any questions, thoughts, comments, please feel free to email me. If anything I've said is unclear, any questions, I'm happy to try to answer you via email. Otherwise, I will see you, well, another lecture next Tuesday, and I think we'll see about when we have our live session scheduled for. In any case, stay well, be well, and have a good weekend.